On the morning of October 6, 1821, a fog settled over the small Massachusetts town of Harrowick, thick and low like a living thing. Locals would later say it came from the river, others swore it rose from the ground itself, from the graves behind St. Orsola's orphan home, where the soil was said to never fully dry. The morning passed quietly. By noon the fog had reached the chapel doors, and by nightfall it began to speak. The first to hear it was Sister Marian, who claimed that as she scrubbed the stone floors, she heard a boy whispering from the rafters, though the rafters were empty. His voice, she said, did not sound like English, nor Latin, nor any tongue she had ever heard. It was soft, melodic, and wrong syllables that seemed to twist inside the ear, reshaping meaning as they were heard. She fainted before she finished her prayer. When the other sisters found her, they said she was murmuring those same sounds through clenched teeth, eyes wide open, one word repeated again and again, Surreal. No one knew what it meant. No one wanted to. 3 days later, the town's priest, Father Ellery Gant, summoned a linguist from Boston to record what the woman had spoken in her delirium. But before the man could arrive, a boy appeared at the gates of St. Orsola's, pale, barefoot, and silent, holding a rosary made of blackened bone. When asked his name, he finally spoke, and every bird within hearing distance fell silent. Brief pause, the sound of the boy's breathing fades under a low, dissonant choir note. The boy was no older than 10, thin, trembling, his skin the color of candle wax. No one in Harrowick had seen him before. When asked where he came from, he pointed east toward the marshes, where the fog never lifted, and where the foundation stones of an old mission still stood. But when Sister Marian, still shaken from her fainting spell, asked again in softer tones, the boy answered. His reply was impossible to write down. The sisters described the sound as a language that moved, words that bent in the air, echoing back as if from a second mouth behind him. Father Gant, uneasy, ordered that the child be kept in the east wing alone. He claimed it was to observe him, but the staff whispered that the priest himself refused to pray in the same building once night fell. Over the following days, the boy began to speak in his sleep phrases recorded in the Orphanage ledger by Sister Marian, though later pages were torn out. The surviving entries are brief. October 10, he whispers of names I have never heard. One sounds like a place, but not on any map. October 11, his words make the walls hum. October 12, he called my name before I spoke it. By the end of the week, 2 of the younger orphans had gone missing. Search parties were formed. No footprints, no forced doors, only the echo of that same impossible language in the empty dormitory, carved faintly into the wooden floor. A slow, rising hum begins under the narration, like static merging with chanting. On the evening of October 14th, 1821, a man named Dr. Nathaniel Corbin arrived in Harrowick under the veil of rain. He was a linguist from Boston University, a scholar of ancient dialects and forgotten creeds. The letter that summoned him, signed by Father Gant, spoke vaguely of a child who recited utterances of no earthly origin. Corbin dismissed it as superstition, until he heard the boy speak. When he entered the East Wing cell, the boy was kneeling beside the bed, tracing patterns in dust. The shapes were geometric yet fluid, lines that spiraled inward before breaking apart. Corbin introduced himself. The boy looked up, lips cracked and pale, and uttered a single word. The sound struck Corbin's ears like a physical blow, something between a whisper and a bell, vibrating beneath comprehension. He staggered back, unable to reproduce it even moments later. He spent 3 nights at St. Orsola's, recording the boy's speech phonetically, but when he reviewed the notes, he noticed something disturbing. The symbols he had drawn, each one an attempt to capture the boy's syllables, changed. The ink bled, reshaping into new characters, and every morning he woke with fresh bruises along his ribs, as though something had pressed upon him while he slept. Soft scratching sound, paper turning in his surviving field journal. One line stands out, written in haste. It is not speech as we know it, it is remembrance, The boy does not learn this language, he recalls it. On the fourth night, Corbin attempted to record the boy's voice onto wax cylinders. But by dawn, his instruments were shattered. His final note reads, "The voice is not meant to be heard twice." Audio fades with a soft hiss, as if the cylinder itself is still turning. When Dr. Corbin disappeared, his room was left untouched for 3 days. Father Gant, against the sisters' protests, ordered the locks broken. They found his journals, his coat, and 4 wax cylinders wrapped in linen and sealed with black thread. Each was labeled in Corbin's trembling hand, utterance I, Roman 2, Roman 3, and Roman 4. That night, after midnight prayers, Father Gant brought the cylinders to his study. He was a man of conviction, not imagination, but witnesses would later describe hearing something from behind his closed door, not quite words, but the distant murmur of many voices speaking at once. He began with utterance I. The cylinder turned, and the boy's voice filled the room, low, layered, impossible. What should have been a child's whisper carried the weight of something ancient, as though each word reached backward through time. According to the fragments of his diary recovered later, Gant wrote, "The sound makes the crucifix vibrate, the air trembles. There is structure here, grammar, rhythm, and intent. It is a liturgy, but not ours. By utterance Roman 3, he could no longer stop." His handwriting deteriorated, looping and broken. He began inserting unfamiliar symbols between his Latin notes. On the last page, only 2 words remained legible: "He understands me." The following morning, the sisters found him kneeling before the chapel altar, muttering the boy's words with perfect precision. His eyes were unfocused, and the skin beneath them had darkened to gray. When they tried to move him, he whispered something that froze them in place. Low, distorted sound overlapping voices. After Father Gant's disappearance, St. Orsola's orphan home began to change. The sisters blamed the cold, the damp, the endless fog that now clung to the building even on clear mornings. But the changes were not of weather. They were structural, audible. The walls began to murmur. At first, it was dismissed as the wind, but soon even the youngest children noticed the difference. When pressed against the wood at night, they could hear whispers, rhythmic, patient, like recitations in a foreign chapel. The words were the same as the boys. Sister Marian kept a candle burning through the night, terrified to sleep. In her private journal, one later recovered from the ashes of the orphanage, she wrote, "They whisper where no mouths exist. The walls breathe. The plaster bends when the boy prays." The boy, confined to the east wing, no longer needed to speak aloud. The language now lived within the building itself, spreading like a contagion. Symbols appeared carved into the banisters, thin as veins, their shapes shifting subtly when touched. 2 more orphans went missing. One was found beneath the chapel floorboards, eyes open, lips bloodied from what looked like biting through his own tongue. In his clenched hand was a splinter of wood etched with the same mark that had begun to spread across the orphanage, a spiral cut through by a single downward stroke. A faint thrum begins, deep and resonant, the sound of air vibrating through hollow wood. By late November of 1821, the whispers had reached the town. At first, the stories came from the children, those who passed St. Ursula's on their way to the river. They claimed they could hear chanting even when no one was near the gates, words that left an ache in their heads, a pressure behind the eyes. Animals refused to go near the orphanage, horses reared. Dogs howled until dawn. The town elders convened inside Harrowick Chapel, led by the new priest, Reverend Simon Pell, a rigid man with a voice like winter. He declared that St. Ursula's was a nest of unholy utterance, and that silence must be restored by flame. That night, men carrying torches and kerosene surrounded the orphanage. The sisters, terrified, begged for mercy, but through the upper window of the east wing, the boy appeared, standing motionless, his eyes reflecting the firelight like glass. He began to speak. Witnesses said the torches dimmed. The flames bent inward toward him, as though drawn to breathe instead of air. The men dropped their weapons, clutching their ears. Some began to pray. One man started laughing, laughter that quickly turned into choking. The sound of fire flickers, then reverses faintly, as though the burning is being undone. In December of 1821, a delegation arrived from Boston, 2 men and a woman representing the Massachusetts Ecclesiastical Inquiry Board. Their purpose was official, to investigate the alleged contagion of unholy speech within St. Orsola's orphan home. Their names were Professor Elias Wren, Dr. Harriet Vale, and Father Alcott, a scholar of early Christian linguistics. They found Harrowick nearly deserted. Many of the townsfolk had fled to neighboring parishes, claiming the fog whispered at night. When the investigators entered the orphanage, they described a silence so absolute it seemed alive. Dust hung motionless in the air. Every surface bore faint etchings, patterns too deliberate to be scratches, too precise to be vandalism. In the east wing, they found the boys' cell, empty except for a single symbol carved deep into the floor, the same spiral cut through by a downward stroke. Professor Wren sketched the symbol and sent it to colleagues in Cambridge. Within days, one replied that it resembled markings discovered on a stone tablet, unearthed in northern Maine decades earlier, markings predating known indigenous languages. The translation attempt had failed. The lines were said to produce echoes when traced aloud. Dr. Vale conducted interviews with the remaining sisters. All gave the same account, that the boys' words could be felt rather than heard, that they altered memory itself. One nun claimed she could no longer recall her own prayers without hearing his voice underneath. Low hum rises beneath narration, soft, almost human breathing woven into the sound. By early January of 1822, the investigators had collected dozens of fragments from St. Orsola's walls, floors, and Dr. Corbin's torn journals. Professor Wren attempted to transcribe the symbols, while Dr. Vale experimented with vocalizing the sounds aloud, but each attempt produced disturbing effects. The first was subtle, a shiver down the spine, a sudden dizziness, a memory that felt borrowed. By the third day, Dr. Vale began hearing the boy's voice at all hours, not from the walls, not from any room, but inside her own head. At first, it was just a whisper, a single syllable she could not repeat without trembling. Soon, it became full phrases, overlapping her thoughts, repeating what she intended to say before she spoke it. Professor Wren recorded his own experiences in a diary. I hear him when I close my eyes. He recites names of things I have never seen, places that do not exist. My tongue moves in imitation before I am aware. It is not speech, it is possession. Father Alcott, a man of faith and reason, attempted to bless the symbols, recite the Lord's Prayer over them, and burn the fragments. The symbols did not burn. They did not fade. Instead, the smoke coiled into the shape of the spiral, the same mark found carved in every corner of the orphanage. By the 5th night, all 3 investigators were unable to sleep. They described the same recurring dream, standing in the fog outside St. Orsola's, facing the boy, who spoke without moving his lips, uttering words that made the air bleed. Soft echo of overlapping whispers, indistinct but layered, like dozens of children speaking at once. By mid-January 1822, St. Orsola's had become more than a building, it had become a presence. The investigators noticed it first in small, almost imperceptible ways. A corridor longer than memory allowed, a door that opened onto a wall, a staircase that curved into shadow where it should have ended. Professor Wren described one morning, I went to the east wing. The boy's cell was across the hall. Then, somehow, it was behind me. I did not move. The hallway had moved, as though the house itself had swallowed me. The symbols carved into floors, and beams seemed to pulse when touched. They hummed beneath fingertips, vibrating against the investigator's bones. Dr. Vale reported seeing the symbols flicker, like candlelight on water, reshaping into letters she did not know, but somehow understood. Even the children who remained in the orphanage began to change. They no longer slept in beds but sat cross-legged in circles, murmuring fragments of the language under their breath. Their eyes were vacant yet alert, and some whispered that the boy had taught them the wind. Father Alcott, desperate, attempted to sanctify the hallways with holy water. The droplets hissed as they touched the floors, as though the house itself rejected them. He recoiled, noting in his journal, "The orphanage is alive, not in flesh, but in thought. The boy's voice resides in its timbers, its plaster, it waits." A low, resonant thrum, growing steadily, almost like a heartbeat beneath the narration. By February of 1822, the town of Harrowick had grown restless. Reports of missing children, whispers in the fog, and walls that spoke drew a crowd at the edge of St. Orsola's. Parents demanded action. The elders, still shaken by the events of November, called for a purge, a complete cleansing of the orphanage. Men and women carried torches, iron tools, and holy symbols. The investigators tried to warn them. The building and the language within could not be subdued by fire or prayer alone. But the crowd surged forward, driven by fear. Inside, the remaining children had gathered in the east wing. They chanted softly, the syllables harmonizing with the timbre of the orphanage itself. When the first torch struck the wall, the wood bent inward, a hollow, groaning scream echoing through the hall. The children's voices rose in tandem, repeating the boy's words, amplified by the very structure of the building. Witnesses later claimed to see doors vanish, corridors twist, and windows open onto nothing but fog. A man trying to reach the children disappeared entirely, swallowed by a hall that had not existed minutes before. Screams echoed for hours. When the crowd finally retreated, driven by terror and inexplicable pain, the orphanage stood intact. Low, droning hum, as if the building itself is inhaling. After the failed purge, the investigators knew they had to leave Harrowick, but the town itself had changed. The fog that clung to the streets was no longer mist, it was voice. Each step carried echoes of the boy's language, slipping between thought and sound. Roads seemed longer than memory allowed. Familiar paths twisted back on themselves. Professor Wren recorded in his journal, "I walked east toward the river appeared west. Every step returns me to the orphanage. It is not the land that moves, it is the language guiding me, doctor." Vale's account was worse. At night, the syllables whispered in her sleep, repeating fragments of her own thoughts back at her, altered. She dreamt she was walking the streets of Boston, but every house bore the spiral mark, every window reflected the boy's eyes. She awoke shaking, writing down words she could not consciously recall, fearing what she had already learned in sleep. Father Alcott began muttering prayers backward, testing whether the language could be combated with inversion. But the words, he claimed, repeated themselves in his own voice before he could finish. Each syllable, each inflection carried intent, not speech, but command. Low, resonant hum, rising and overlapping like dozens of unseen mouths. By March of 1822, the investigators attempted a last, desperate measure to record and study the language scientifically. Professor Wren and Dr. Vale set up charts, transcriptions, and phonetic notations. They analyzed the spirals, the shifting symbols, and the fragments they had collected from St. Orsola's walls. But every attempt revealed an unsettling truth. The language was not linear, it did not conform to grammar, its structure was alive, responding to the observer's thoughts. Symbols rearranged themselves when viewed, sounds changed when repeated. Even the simplest sentence could transform into layers of meaning that no human mind could hold. Father Alcott, who had once sought divine protection, wrote in his journal, "It is not meant to be spoken or written. It exists between thought and thought, memory and imagination. To record it is to fail, and failure itself has consequences." The investigators noticed these consequences almost immediately. Notes disappeared, ink bled into strange shapes, and diagrams shifted overnight. Wren's sketches of symbols sometimes appeared altered with scratches resembling faint, human teeth marks. Dr. Vale claimed that when she traced a symbol, she felt a pressure in her skull, as though the shape was pressing back. By now, the boys' language had begun to invade their perception. They heard whispers in the wind, patterns in the flickering candlelight, echoes in the rhythm of their own heartbeat. Attempting to write, to translate, or to understand, it was no longer merely futile. It was dangerous. Soft, layered whispers overlap with the sound of a heartbeat. By mid-March, desperation drove the investigators back to the east wing of St. Orsola's, hoping to confront the boy directly. The orphanage had changed again. Hallways twisted impossibly, floors creaked where no weight fell. Fog, thick and luminous, filled the rooms like liquid. The very air seemed to bend around them. The boy was there, seated on a low dais of wood that had not existed in previous visits. His eyes were wide, unblinking, reflecting shadows that no candle cast. He did not speak at first. The investigators felt their thoughts curling inward, memories folding over themselves, as if the boy were sifting through them. Soft overlapping whispers, low, resonant tones like bells underwater. When the boy finally spoke, his voice was layered, multitonal, carrying words from an impossible depth. You remember me before I was here. You will forget me after I leave. Each syllable reached into the investigators' minds. Wren staggered, clutching his head, whispering fragments of places he had never seen, names of rivers and towns that did not exist. Doctor. Vale cried out as visions of St. Orsola's burned and rebuilt themselves in her mind, brick by brick, wall by wall. Father Alcott, trembling, recited prayers aloud. The boy tilted his head, and the words returned to him warped, reshaped into syllables that sounded familiar yet utterly alien. His laughter, soft but piercing, echoed across hallways that seemed to stretch into infinity. A long pause, whispering fades, replaced by a low, throbbing hum. After their encounter with the boy, the investigators fled St. Orsola's, hoping to escape the nightmare. But the town itself had changed. Harrowick was no longer merely a collection of houses and streets. It had become a vessel for the boy's language, its fog, its walls, even its stones whispering syllables that made memory falter. Professor Wren described it in his journal. Every corner, every doorway seems aware of us. The language spreads through the streets. When we walk, the ground beneath our feet murmurs our names in patterns we cannot ignore. Doctor. Vale found that even attempts to leave the town were futile. Roads curved back upon themselves. Rivers bent like living ribbons. Every turn, every bridge, seemed intent on guiding them back towards St. Orsola's. The remaining townspeople avoided them, eyes wide with terror. Some whispered that children who had disappeared in the months before had returned, altar, quiet, pale, reciting strange syllables under their breath. One woman claimed she woke to find the boy standing at her window, whispering her dreams back to her before she could speak them aloud. Soft, overlapping chanting, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Harrowick had become a memory embedded in sound, a language that could not be forgotten. The boy was no longer confined to a single building. He had made the town his vessel. The investigators realized a truth more terrible than any ghost. They could not leave the town unmarked. Every thought, every step, had become a syllable in a language that the world was never meant to know. By spring of 1822, the investigators realized that documenting the horrors of St. Orsola's and Harrowick would be their only defense against the language. Professor Wren, Dr. Vale, and Father Alcott attempted to write detailed reports, hoping that knowledge might serve as a barrier. But even their words became infected. Every description of the boy, every attempt to map the town, twisted into unfamiliar shapes on the page. Symbols appeared in margins, forming spirals and angles that defied comprehension. Wren noted in horror, "It writes itself. My words are no longer mine. I am merely a conduit for something older than reason." As they attempted to leave, the fog clung tighter. Voices rose from nowhere and everywhere at once, echoing, answering questions before they were asked, revealing the investigators' deepest fears. Sleep became impossible. Doctor. Vale's journal recounts visions of herself speaking the language while awake, unintentionally teaching it to strangers who were not there. Even messages sent to colleagues in Boston failed. Letters disappeared en route, or arrived scrawled with indecipherable symbols. One colleague, who attempted to read a partial transcript, fell into a delirium that lasted 3 weeks, low, resonant chanting, overlaid with overlapping whispers that feel almost human. Narrator, the investigators understood a grim truth: the language was not content with silence. It demanded propagation. Every thought recorded, every syllable heard, was a chance to weave more of the boy into the fabric of the world. By the end of March, they no longer knew if they were documenting the boy, or if he was documenting them. Each warning carried the risk of making the listener remember, to recall something humanity was never meant to know. A final, low breath, like whisper, fades as the narration ends. By April of 1822, the investigators were unraveling. Days and nights blurred, hours stretched into incomprehensible loops. The boy's language had embedded itself so deeply within their consciousness that they could no longer distinguish thought from utterance. Words they did not intend emerged from their mouths in fragments of the forbidden tongue. Professor Wren recorded in his diary, "I am no longer certain where I end and the language begins. I dream in spirals, and when I wake, I hear it in my own voice. I am forgetting the English names of my own family. The boy speaks in me and through me. Doctor." Vale's notebooks became a tangled chaos of Latin, English, and symbols that reformed each time she glanced away. Her reflection in the mirror seemed to shift subtly, eyes wider, lips slightly parted, as if whispering beneath her skin. She began to see shapes in the fog outside Harrowick, the boy standing silently in impossible places, his gaze following her, unblinking, waiting. Father Alcott's faith failed him last. He attempted exorcisms within his own quarters, sprinkling holy water over every page, but the droplets twisted into patterns that resembled the spirals carved in the orphanage. Each prayer returned to him inverted, fragmented, and repeated in tones he could not bear. A faint, throbbing hum grows beneath narration, like hundreds of tiny breaths in unison. By May of 1822, Harrowick had ceased to resemble any ordinary town. The streets no longer followed maps. They bent and looped in impossible ways. Buildings shifted subtly when unobserved, doors opening onto walls, windows looking into rooms that should not exist. The boy's language had become the architecture itself. Even animals seemed aware. Horses refused to cross certain streets. Cats lingered in corners where walls whispered. Dogs howled in unison when footsteps approached St. Orsola's. Birds that nested in the town vanished entirely, leaving empty eaves and hollow branches. The investigators, still struggling with their own fractured minds, recorded these phenomena. Professor Wren wrote, "The town remembers. Every corner, every stone, every plank vibrates with syllables I cannot understand. I see the symbols reflected in the river, the fog, even the rain. The boy's language is no longer speech. It is the pulse of the town itself. Doctor." Vale noted that even attempts to communicate with outsiders failed. When she called to neighbors, the words came back altered, twisted, carrying fragments of the forbidden syllables. In some cases, strangers began repeating the boy's language before they could articulate their own thoughts. Low, resonant hum under narration, growing in intensity, layered with distorted whispers. Narrator, by now, the town itself was a vessel. Every street, every house, every shuttered window had become a syllable in a language that had once been forgotten. Harrowick had been claimed, not by a child, not by a building, but by memory itself. The investigators knew the truth. Leave Harrowick, and the language would follow. Stay, and it would consume them entirely. Pause, the hum fades into silence, punctuated only by a faint whisper. A single word, surreal. By June of 1822, desperation had driven the investigators to their last hope, to contain the language before it spread beyond Harrowick. They built a chamber in the center of the orphanage, reinforced with iron, salt, and layers of sacred texts, hoping to trap the boy's voice and the memory it carried. Father Alcott, trembling, recited prayers in Latin and in the forbidden tongue, the syllables mingling into a resonant chant that shook the rafters. Doctor. Vale traced symbols on the floor with chalk, while Professor Wren attempted to record the child's voice, now emanating from every wall, every beam, every breath of fog. At first, the chamber seemed to hold. The air grew thick, almost tactile. The language pressed into itself like a contained storm. But soon, the symbols began to shift, splitting and reforming faster than the eye could follow. The boy's voice layered upon itself, echoing through unseen corridors, and then through the investigator's own thoughts. Wren's journal notes the horror. The language is not contained. It is multiplication itself. Every attempt to hold it only spreads it further. I hear my own thoughts reciting it back at me. We are the chamber. We are the vessel. Doctor. Vale screamed as the chalk lines twisted into spirals that seemed to lift off the floor, hovering, twisting in midair. Father Alcott collapsed, muttering syllables in a voice that was no longer his own. Low, high, pitched overlapping whispers, dissonant, layered, almost unbearable. By the summer of 1822, Harrowick had begun to vanish, not in fire or flood, but in memory itself. Travelers who approached the town found the streets obscured by dense fog, the buildings impossibly tall or impossibly short, bending angles that defied reason. Locals spoke of hearing children's voices whispering their own names, only to forget them the moment they turned away. The few who remained reported that the air itself carried syllables from the boy's language. Windows, shutters, and walls shimmered, shifting subtly as if the town were breathing. Animals avoided the place entirely. Crows circled endlessly above, never landing. Professor Wren's and Dr. Vale's final correspondences, later discovered in Boston, describe the town as a living archive. Every corner, every alley, every abandoned garden had become a syllable, every building a phrase. Any attempt to map Harrowick failed. Roads looped impossibly, rivers ran backward, and stairs led to rooms that had no entrances. Low, almost imperceptible hum, like 1,000 layered breaths. Narrator, by the time outsiders attempted to investigate decades later, they found only fog, ruins, and a faint resonance in the air that could not be captured on paper. St. Orsola's was gone, or perhaps it was everywhere, a language embedded in the very landscape. Harrowick had become a memory that refused to exist, a town spoken into being by a voice no one was meant to hear. The boy was never seen again, and yet, some claimed that if you stand at the river's edge at night and listen closely, you can hear the faintest whisper of a child, uttering a language older than reason, older than fear. Pause, the whisper fades to nothing. Silence, then the faint echo of the word. Surreal. Centuries may pass, but the story of the boy from St. Ursula's is not one that time can erase. Harrowick itself has faded from maps, yet the language remains, embedded in fog, in ruins, in memory, and in the minds of those who dare to remember. The boy was not a child in the conventional sense. He was a vessel, a memory, a conduit for something ancient, older than human history, older than speech itself. Those who study forgotten places, lost towns, and anomalous events report subtle disturbances. A town that shifts, a whisper that repeats a thought before it is spoken, a chill that moves against the wind. The investigators of 1822 are gone, vanished or consumed, but their writings linger like fragile bones, hinting at truths that cannot be fully known. Soft echo of children's voices layered, rising and falling like waves. Narrator, the boy's language is not merely words. It is an instrument of thought, a script for reality itself. It reshapes perception, memory, and ultimately, existence. To hear it is to remember what humanity has long forgotten, truths that terrify because they cannot be contained, cannot be rationalized, and cannot be undone. And so it persists, each whisper of fog, each reflection in shattered glass, each hesitation in thought carries a syllable of that language. Somewhere, always, the boy watches, smiling, not with malice, but with the patience of eternity. A single breath, then silence, finally the faintest lingering utterance, a single word repeated as if the world itself had learned it, surreal.